agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Warndorf, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined by the professor of law at Chase Law School, Ken Katkin. Ken, once again, welcome to The Politics Guys.
It is always great to be back, Trey.
It's always fun to be doing this with you, Ken. Now, this week we're going to take the show on, and then we'll be back in 2 weeks. We get to come back a little bit more rapidly than we normally do. Because Mike is going to be taking a little bit of a well-deserved vacation. So everybody will get a little bit of extra Trey and Ken in the short run. So, for us this time of year, we're kind of, I guess you guys aren't quite there yet. My school starts much more rapidly so that we get done by Thanksgiving now. So we're just about ready to start the semester. So it's almost, I call it quote unquote fall because it's kind of fall.
Yeah. 100 degrees.
Not really at all.
Fall. Yeah, 100 degrees outside.
115. 115 out here in Oklahoma.
But you can still call it fall.
We beat Death Valley. So we beat Death Valley and we broke the Dust Bowl record. Just a little hot. So
yeah.
Were you guys were 100, right?
I'm actually in New York now, but it was in the high 90s here also, and in Cincinnati it was 100.
See, there you go. Just a mere 100 degrees.
Yeah.
Well, if you were listening to Politics Guys, this is not the old man's edition. We're not just going to talk about the Weather Channel today. What we've got on deck, we're going to talk about the... I like that I got you to laugh at that. We're going to start off talking about the kind of the wrap up to the January 6th committee with a special focus on the Secret Service text message issue that has really been playing out this week. We're going to talk about the newly released Uvalde video that came out this past week, which, man, we'll talk about that. We're going to talk about, well, maybe there can be a good guy with a gun as we move over to Indiana and the mall, almost half of a shooting. The police shooting in New York, this isn't something new. We're going to talk about kind of a longer form, but on Thursday, just yesterday, there was a new one that kind of ran into this, trying to talk about police and their interaction with shootings. And then we're going to move forward. Members of Congress were arrested on Tuesday. We'll talk about that and some of the things surrounding that and the abortion protests. We got a couple other stories depending on time. But that's what we're going to have for you on deck when we come back after just a moment. Okay, so Ken, we're going to start by talking about, the January 6th committee. It continues to turn up information this week, although in this case, it isn't as much, at least part of it isn't as much about what it did turn up as what it didn't turn up, right? So maybe in this sense, required text messages not appearing and the absence of action from Donald Trump. But why don't we start by kind of taking a look at this past week as we unfolded what was going on with text messages. So let's kind of set this up. The Secret Service this week, according to committee members, only turned over one text, that's right, one text, in response to the January 6th committee subpoena. Now, why is that the case? Well, according to the Secret Service, it was due to a pre-scheduled reset of devices. Committee members disagree. In fact, these messages were long ago requested in other formats, and as a matter of fact, long before the reset. Representative Raskin, as a matter of fact, to members of the Congress said, quote, "I smell a rat," end quote, when it came to the issue. As a matter of fact, the January 6th committee released a statement this week concerning the system mitigation, i.e. this reset of devices. In the committee's word, quote, "The U.S. Secret Service system mitigation process went forward on January 27th, 2021, just 3 weeks after the attack on the Capitol, in which the Vice President of the United States, while under the protection of the Secret Service, was steps from a violent mob hunting for him." Little brief break. "It may represent a possible violation of the Federal Records Act." Now, yesterday, topping onto this statement, that's June 21st, the Department, I said June, July 21st, the Department of Homeland Security Inspector General informed the Secret Service to stop looking into the matter because it notes that it is now, quote, an ongoing criminal investigation, end quote. In other words, into those lost text messages. To put this in this broader context, one of the reasons that there is a desire for this is that off the record, Secret Service members have disputed some of the allegations, statements, and testimony of individuals, especially Ms. Hutchinson, as it relates to their actions. But of course, nobody has been willing to talk about that under oath, and now the evidence no longer exists. So, Ken, what do you think about this ongoing Secret Service? There's a lot of different possibilities here. What's your take?
It's really hard to untangle. My take is that there's been some wrongdoing, but in terms of who's the wrongdoer and exactly how did this happen, it seems difficult. I first, like, with this idea of a routine data backup erasing all these texts. That's extraordinary. I mean, you and I both work in universities that don't have nearly the technical resources that the U.S. Secret Service has. And, we get routine data backups of our university emails and things like that. And I don't remember ever being told, that we have to back up every one of them, every old email ourselves, or else we'll lose them all. It seems like a very unusual data practice for sure. And to the point of, being completely implausible, I think. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, I was going to kind of add to that to kind of give an example because you mentioned us working for universities and the kind of data backup in that system. So let me just give listeners maybe a specific example. My former institution, Daytona State College down in Florida, has what's called the Sunshine Laws. And effectively what that means is that anything that is touched by government funds has to be available upon request to citizens, even if it isn't automatically made available. So that is so prevalent that means even if you're working for a public institution, as I did for college, every single email, phone call, etc., that I make upon request, as long as it's redacting any kind of information from a student's grade, or there's some things that can be redacted, but almost every single piece of that has to be maintained, kept, so that when you'd have requests for information, that we could produce those by a timely manner. We're talking about you have days to provide that.
Yeah,
so
and
my little tiny college had to keep, phone, email, all of those records, and then provide it within hours, effectively. So just to kind of give a, you say that, and I thought, well, let's give a really concrete example of what that looks like, So again, as you pointed out, it's not as if we're going to have the resources of the Secret Service.
Right. They couldn't afford the storage space on their hard drives or something, and they had to clear them off. But it's the most underfunded public institutions manage to have data practices where they can keep things like that. The IT departments don't routinely just delete everything that professors or even staff members at universities are putting on their computers. And it's just absolutely implausible to me that there was anything routine about this. You mentioned the violation of the Federal Records Act. That's probable. That's not an act where there's very serious consequences for violations, but it could be obstruction of justice as well, because the timeline's not completely clear to me, but it seems at least possible, based on the way some of the news reporting has been, that some of these deletions happened after they'd already been requested by congressional committees and possibly after they'd already been requested by the Justice Department as well, although we don't know whether the Justice Department ever requested these. But if they had, then those are additional timelines to think about. It would, I think the more serious possible legal problem here, and there has been some reporting that a criminal probe's been opened. I would think if it's a criminal probe, it's going to relate to obstruction of justice rather than just to the Federal Records Act.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, the Federal Records Act, that was what was in the January 6th committee statement. The Inspector General is the one who talked about the criminal investigation more in the line that you were talking about. So that wasn't my language, but but the committee and then
the
the
committee's
Inspector General's language.
Yeah, I guess probably the committee didn't want to use the word criminal at this point because they don't have evidence of crime. They just have evidence of disappeared records, which would violate the Federal Records Act. But the Federal Records Act is not a criminal statute, but obstruction of justice is a crime. And so I think that's interesting. It's hard to know, who would be behind this, and that's kind of where I find all the mystery is who could have actually accomplished this.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's the one possibility is that you have somebody in the Trump orbit who is putting pressure on somebody in the Secret Service to make this happen. But I mean, while that's possible, it seems unlikely given the level of separation you have in some ways between president and those. I don't, thoughts about that? I mean,
well,
I've seen that floated, but it doesn't seem as likely. But again, I mean, there's things that we see that have happened that are not likely that are happening, right? So it's hard to then discount it.
Yeah, I mean, right. I don't think it's unlikely that kind of pressure would have come from the Trump camp, but I would think it's more that to actually accomplish it, you'd have to have, like the IT staff that could actually accomplish it, I would think would be professional civil servants and
exactly.
who would know that it's not legal. And so anybody who's, if that order came down from on high, I don't quite see how it gets done without involving a lot of people who would then know about it and would know that it was illegal and wouldn't have great incentive to keep quiet about it. So that's kind of the part that's confusing me.
Well, and additionally, unlike, say, so it's January 27th, meaning that that you are in the waning moments of the Trump administration, meaning that the kind of even internal pressure that could be brought to bear on a civil servant couldn't possibly last, but in comparison, but a moment.
Well,
which is also
it's already the Biden administration. In fact, it's the 27th.
That's true.
Came in on the 20th. Yeah. So these things would have to have been set in motion by the departing Trump administration and just not noticed by the Biden administration for that to be the case. But it didn't. Yeah, 27. Biden would have been in a week already. He probably wouldn't have had very many of his people in yet in these agencies, but. Because, of course, because McConnell was slowballing him on his appointments and things like that. And I don't think he got much more than a Secretary of Defense confirmed during his first week in office. But so it would be the chaos, though, of having the new administration, but still having a lot of holdover Trump people in the agencies at that moment in time.
Yeah, I had not thought about that. Yeah, I had timeline just a little off. True point.
But yeah,
I guess that then again leads to chaos.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? I don't even know exactly what the timeline was. Say for someone like Tony Ornato, his name comes up a lot in this. He had been a career Secret Service person, but then he'd been a political appointee in the Trump White House, working for Mark Meadows. But he would have still had a lot of his contacts in the Secret Service, and his name comes up in connection with Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony about hearing about Trump trying to grab the steering wheel. Like apparently it was from Tony Ornato that she heard that. So Ornato seems to play a kind of key role in terms of being a link between the Trump political operations and the Secret Service. But I think he would have lost his job as deputy chief of staff the day that Trump and Meadows left the White House. I think he did return to his career job in the Secret Service, but I'm not quite sure what he was doing on those days or whether he would have been in a position to do this. It's just really, I think we're going to need to learn more just by waiting to hear more facts come out. There's a lot we could speculate about, but it's too opaque, I think, to really see through it all right now.
Which leads to something else, we talked about, Ken, earlier on in the process. We followed the committee, and that is, of course, yesterday was the wrap up effectively to the January 6th committee. And it's probably the wrap up to the committee in many ways as we move into November, because it seems unlikely to me that is going to continue past the election. So, unlike, kind of like the season of a show you really like, I'm not sure if all of the threads will ever get finished. What do you think about that as well before we get into other things from Thursday night's January 6th committee meeting.
Well, I don't see any reason they wouldn't continue until the end of the year. The election will happen in November, but the current Congress is in office until the end of December, and I think they will continue at least till then. Whether they're able to continue into the next Congress depends, of course, on the outcome of the election. But I think if the Dems still have the majority, and if the Jan 6 committee wants to continue, I do think it'll continue into the new year. A lot of people are saying the Dems will not still have the majority, and then there's no way that it'll be able to continue if they don't. But last night's it seemed a little anticlimactic to me in a way, because I think when they scheduled this to be the final hearing, they thought Pottinger was going to basically be the most explosive witness that they had. But then, like during the course of these other hearings that we saw earlier, Cassidy Hutchinson showed up, and I think she was the star of the whole season.
Yeah.
And then even because of her, Pat Cipollone showed up, and he's I guess the best supporting actor or something. But I think by the time you get to Pottinger, it was like there wasn't that much more really that he had to say. It was kind of like that was like the primetime slot for the star witness, but he was very far from being the star witness, I thought, by the time things already shook out.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's truth to that. Now, one of the other, before we get into maybe the specifics, one of the other macro level questions that has come forward is to say the January 6th committee at this point, they have done it in what you might call as, we were even talking about it in kind of television design style. You're getting these clips, they're played in pieces. And one of the questions is going to be is, are we going to get all of this material released in its whole gathered form, in a more, you might say, kind of a 9/11 commission kind of way? Maybe in this case, I would say as a knock against the committee to be, okay, yeah, great, have it on, have the serialized television version, but you need to release the book too, or you need to release everything itself as well. And at this point, they haven't done that. What do you think comes down the pike on that front, and why do you think it might be the case that it's all we've gotten is, again, for lack of a better term, the TV version?
Well, I think that's because of the haste that's imposed, because of the everybody's operating under the understanding that if the Republicans get the House in this November election, then the plug will be pulled on the committee. So I think because of that, the committee has to kind of think about what's the maximum impact we can make, given that we've got a limited time frame here. And if they were spending all their efforts, writing reports, they wouldn't be able to cover as much ground as they've been covering in the televised hearings, and they wouldn't have the impact of the televised hearings. So, I mean, I think if there had been, a statute enacted, as with the 9/11 Commission, to create a commission and let it do its work until it was done, then that kind of framework would be much more conducive to publishing the kind of report that you're talking about. And I actually think they will publish a report if they can keep working for another couple of years. But if the plug is pulled on them but in 2022, then I think, how could a report ever come out?
So why don't we get into some of the additional outcomes from the committee? Again, maybe not as revelatory. One, at least, that stood out for me was the Trump storyboarding for his speech post the next day, so on January 7th, where he doesn't, for example, he explicitly says, look, I don't want to say that the election was over, doesn't like the word tomorrow. There's a number of issues that he has as he's kind of moving through that sequence. I found that to be a worthy new addition, in the sense that you're watching, it's something we all knew, but Trump kind of worked through the early aspects of the lie. What did you think about that portion of the committee's hearing?
Trump. I'm sorry. The portion about Trump working through the early aspects of the lie.
Yes. So you'll notice they released video of where he is trying to do his speech on January 7th.
The January 7th
and so
speech,
you're seeing the edits for it, and him saying, "Look, I don't like the line for me that really stood out was when he says, right, I don't want to say I don't want to say that the election's over. I just want to say that Congress finished its business effectively. The election isn't over, right, and we're not done yet. And that was the video series I was talking about there.
Yeah. Well, that's January 7th, so that's why I wasn't quite following that early. That's already after January 6th. The earlier.
I mean, in the sense that that's the very beginning of his. It's certified, but I'm still not willing to say the election's over. I think of January 7th as being the cement, the beginning of the true, full-blown, the big lie from the Donald Trump camp. And so, yeah. But I mean, of course, the election was already over before that point. But
right, I think they started the big lie when they started all the Giuliani's litigation. The 80 cases that he brought. All of which were filled with lies, and none of which were even got beyond the frivolousness level in court. And also on the sort of to me even much more damning last night than the clip of Trump recording a message on January 7th was the clip from that was played at the very end by Liz Cheney of Steve Bannon telling people back on Halloween, 8 or 9 days before the election. Here's what's going to happen. If Trump is losing, he's going to say that he won. He's going to call the military to shut down all the voting machines. He's going to tell the attorney general to say that the election was fraudulent. And the earlier this happens, the wilder he's going to get. If he's losing on election night, all hell is going to break loose. Bannon was saying all this about 7 or 8 days before the election, and that tape was shown at the end last night. That to me is the most smoking gun evidence ever, because Bannon wasn't speculating. He was talking about what Trump was going to do based on what Trump told Bannon that Trump was going to do. So and
premeditation, effectively.
Premeditation, yeah. And then Trump followed the plan that was already laid out, long before it would have even been possible to know whether there were any irregularities on election day. He already had this plan to, if he's losing, he's just going to say there were. And so that to me was extremely strong evidence of Trump's premeditation.
So, what were there any other moments for you that stood out? We already knew about Trump ignoring all of these pleas from his supporters, including his, Ivanka, pulling himself up and not being willing to interact with any of that. Anything else for you that comes to the forefront, or what do you think?
No, as I said, I thought last night had a weird kind of it seemed weird to me because they had developed, I think when they had scheduled the 7 hearings, the subject of the final hearing was going to be, what did Trump do during these 3 hours? And they had these witnesses in who could speak to that. But as it actually transpired, they had those accounts came out even sooner than the 7th hearing. So everything felt a little bit redundant or repetitive last night, based on things that Cassidy Hutchinson and Pat Cipollone had already said. And, and Pat, both of those two witnesses were not witnesses that, had come forward yet when the final hearing was scheduled. So I think the final hearing was really going to be based on the idea that Pottinger is going to break this story, and the press, Matthews was her name, the press, that the two of them would speak to this. But by now, Cipollone and Hutchinson had already spoke to it. So I think we've heard again and again and again that every person in the White House was trying to tell Trump, you got to stop this, you got to stop this. And the reason he didn't do anything is because he didn't want it stopped. And so that maybe it's a message that bears repeating. And so it was repeated again last night. But I didn't think there was a ton new last night. I thought that the Bannon clip was probably the newest thing, because even though it had come out in the internet a few days earlier, it's really the first thing that we see that's from way before the election that shows that this plan was already hatched way before the election.
As opposed to being a cobbled together or incompetency or these other potential kinds of explanations.
Yeah, I guess if it hadn't been shown to have been hatched before the election, you could never quite rule out that he really believed that there was fraud. right? But I think now you can rule out that he sincerely believed that there was fraud, because this was a plan that was cooked up before it would have been possible for there to be any fraud. And Bannon even forthrightly said, even if he loses, he's just going to say he won and it was fraud. So that was the plan all along. And so I think there's, the last bit of plausible deniability that Trump could have had to say, well, yeah, sure, I did support the insurrection, but that's because I believed I actually won the election. I don't think he's got any. I don't think that holds any water either.
So let's bring this a little bit to the political realities of the moment we are at the coming into the middle and end of July, which is there seems to be a lot of evidence to suggest that Trump wants to announce his candidacy for president, that others would like him to wait till the end of midterm. Do you think that the January 6th, ending here, I mean, in some ways it would seem in one way counterintuitive, but I think it makes Trumpian sense for him to want to respond to all of this with and now I'm running for office again.
Yeah, I mean, actually, one thing I've been thinking about, you use the word counterintuitive, but makes Trumpian sense. One thing I was thinking is, even though the along the same lines as you, is that even though the polling data now, I think, is showing that even the majority of Republicans are saying they don't want him to run again, there's a paradox there, which is that, people like McConnell, I think yesterday were saying, it's going to be a crowded field and this and that, implying that, people are not going to be afraid to run against Trump. But Trump might be thinking, well, that's fine. If it's a crowded field and if I keep, the 33% of Republicans who want to vote for me voting for me, I could win again with 33%, just like last time, because it'll be a crowded field, right, and all these other guys will split the votes on each other. So sort of the paradox there is that his weakness, which is inviting more people to come in and run against him, might be his strength, because if more people come in and run against him, he doesn't need to get as high of a percentage to actually win.
Yeah, and to add to that, I saw McConnell's statement about that. And on the one hand, I think that's an astute prediction on your part. I hadn't thought it through that way. But I think there's a number of individuals who would not throw into the ring. So, for example, DeSantis. I don't think DeSantis runs, even though there is now animosity between those two gentlemen. I don't believe that DeSantis runs at the same time as Trump does, because their bases so largely overlap. And I don't think, as you were pointing out, if Trump runs, that although it's a diminishing amount, he's got such a rabid, they're not going to switch base. I don't think a DeSantis could flip that 30%.
Well, yeah, maybe. I think he might. I think he might run against Trump because
really, okay,
I mean, it's because I do think in a way, the January 6th committee is doing DeSantis a huge favor, because they're beating up on Trump enough that it's causing Trump fatigue among some Republicans, right? Like Trump may have had 50% of Republicans before, and he's down to, probably 35% of Republicans now. Like, some of them are getting sick of him, and most of them are getting sick of him, I think, is what the polling is showing. So that might encourage DeSantis, right? DeSantis might think, well, if I can present myself as Trumpist policies without all the Trump baggage, then there's obviously going to be a constituency for that, because the people who like Trump, maybe it's because they like his policies, and nobody really loves the baggage. And so I think that DeSantis might see that as an opening. And actually, I think if there's a relatively small number of candidates, DeSantis would beat Trump. But I think the big number of candidates things is the problem. Like, I would almost analogize it to Bernie Sanders. Like, if Bernie Sanders ran again, and he's only going to get 30 or 40% of the Democrats and never more than that, well, that would be enough to win if there was a seven other candidates, and they're all roughly equal to each other, and none of them could even get up to 30 or 35. And I actually do think that was Trump's main path to victory in 2016. So I think DeSantis, if he thinks it's just going to be a head-to-head between him and Trump, I think he would not be afraid of that at all. But I think the thing he's got to be more afraid of is whether there's going to be a lot of other hats in the ring, and a risk of splitting the vote.
Well, and I'll add, so this is me being the political communication guy. And something to keep in mind for listeners is that, when we talk about these things that affect elections, these are the things that affect elections around the margins and therefore can have impact, but they're not always the most endemic reasons that one candidate's going to win over another candidate. However, I would say one of the other elements that goes into thinking about the Trump primary, Ken, is the fact that, in my view, one of the reasons I had earlier said that I thought Trump had opportunity, and then later was gonna win, was because I saw him engaging with social media in a way that was highly effective. Not that it was good. I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't mean that in a normative sense, but it was effective to the medium. And because he doesn't have that outlet now, I think that races will play out far different with him kind of sequestered. And again, is that going to be a giant vote move? No, but I do think that will play into a primary race for sure in the way that it played in, leading up into 2016.
Yeah, for sure. I think part of the reason he is getting so damaged by the passage of time, including the January 6th hearings, is that he doesn't have that same platform that he used to have.
Exactly. He can't have his instantaneous responses. I was trying to think of another adjective for them besides. He fires these things off, and I think one of the things that made him, some analysts, difficult to understand was they misunderstood that what for them was normatively, the content being normatively unappealing, did not mean that his mechanism and target was not empirically successful.
Right. He clearly had a constituency, and they were interested in what he had to say, and now they're just not hearing as much of what he has to say.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so Ken, any last thoughts on Trump, January 6th, Secret Service, or anything else there before we move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I am skeptical that he's going to be the nominee. I feel like even though he may benefit from some of the dynamics we've just been talking about, I tend to think that the Trump fatigue phenomenon, which has just been growing and growing, slowly but surely, that's a trajectory that I think is going to continue. So I think by the end of this year, by the beginning of next year, even more Republicans are going to be sick of him, and even more independents are going to be sick of him. And so that, I think his numbers will just basically keep dwindling for a number of the reasons that we said, and that he does not have a realistic chance to be the nominee. I also think he may be misinformed about Justice Department policies, and I think he may think that if he announces early that he's running, that the policy against interfering with elections through criminal investigations would somehow shield him from criminal investigations. But that policy is not at all triggered by how early somebody announces. It's triggered by how close to the election we are. So that he's not gonna no in the year 2023. Nobody is going to be able to rely on the policy against interfering with elections by being an announced candidate. It's just too far before the 2024 election.
Well, on that front, I have asked you this once before, and you answered this, but now we have everything that at least one big part of the package from the January 6th committee. What do you think is the likelihood that Trump faces legal consequences as a result of this?
As a result of his January 6th plot, I think he will. When you say legal consequences, you're also including, I guess, the from the state of Georgia, as well as from the Justice Department. Yeah, I think that the Georgia investigation seems to be moving forward at quite a clip, and I don't see it getting derailed. Within the Justice Department, the particular investigation that seems to be moving along the fastest is the fake electors scheme. Seems to be moving along faster because it involves fewer people and fewer facts than the Capitol invasion of January 6th. But I think the fake electors scheme is going to lead to some fairly high level indictments. I think Eastman and Giuliani and Sidney Powell are going to be indicted, and that could lead to Trump. I can't say that it will, but I think it will depend if any of them will cut a deal. If any of the people a step below Trump will want to become cooperators, it could lead to an indictment of Trump. I think if none of them do, if they all just take the bullet and say that it was all them, Trump will escape responsibility for that. But that would sort of be how I see those shaping out.
Okay, so here's my last question, because I know, on the show we oftentimes will do, what we're reading. And one of the things that you always enjoy is kind of the good spy, right? I mean, the espionage, that always seems to be one of the things you're doing. So here is my my novel. We're going to call it a novel, right? Like my novel prediction, my novel in that sense, though. What's the likelihood that, we see some kind of prosecution towards Trump and suddenly he turns up and he's hanging out in Russia?
Yeah, I would. I wonder about that too. But I think if they indict him, they'll move to take away his passport right away. So that'll make it a little bit harder for him. Now, certainly that wouldn't make it impossible for him to get snuck out of the country on private planes or something. But yeah, it could happen. It could happen. That's since you mentioned it. One thing that never came up in any of the January 6th hearings was any kind of Russian hand in any of it. And I you haven't heard much about that in the media, but I was always wondering about it because it did seem like, earlier on in his administration, Russia's hand was in a lot of things that he did. And it seemed like he took a lot of advice. And in some ways, he seemed to model this whole thing on the way Putin manages elections in Russia. And but, I don't know. I mean, I guess there must not be any evidence tying Russia to this because nobody's really brought it out. But it is something I would speculate about as well.
Well, I would say on that, since we're down the speculation route, if you are an authoritarian regime, Putin otherwise, there's no particular reason to encourage somebody to do something they're already doing the way you would want them to do, right? So, so I guess I wasn't as surprised, right? Like, it's usually when it's more even if you're at the cajoling and friendly stage, but you're not sure the other person's going to do the thing it aligns in your benefit. That's, at least internationally relation speaking, that's when you're going to start exerting that pressure. But if you already know this individual for self-interested reasons is going to do precisely the kind of chaotic thing you'd hope would happen, you can just kind of step back and watch, right? So that as a matter of fact, that was my takeaway from this, was to say, I don't think there's much evidence there, because what would have been, besides making it harder for Team Trump, what would have been what would have been helpful for a foreign agent to do there that was not already happening better, potentially, without their influence? That would be my take, to be honest.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I mean, if John Eastman's capable of coming up with this strategy, then Putin's agents don't have to tell it to John Eastman. He's already come up with it himself, I guess. But it's I was just thinking more that maybe none of them came up with this strategy. Maybe the only way that the origins of this whole scheme, came because it was suggested to them from foreign powers. But I have no evidence for that at all. So I have to concede that if there was any evidence for that, it probably would have come out by now.
Yeah, I mean, especially given there would be no reason for the January 6th committee to not want to include that or to investigate those threads. Now, but again, I will go back, though. I still think, even if it doesn't happen, I think maybe we need to write the book, like, kind of the what if history book. So Trump and Russia could be the what if history book, the alternative history. I don't know. That could just be phenomenal. Or maybe we'd change his name slightly, right? He'd be like Pumped, we do his name backwards. But be that as it may, we should probably get away from vague speculation about that to some more real things. So, but before we make that break, I want to say that this is going to be this is the end of our ad-supported preview. So, Ken and I, we are certainly not done. We're going to be moving on talking about the Uvalde video. We're going to be talking about the good guy with the gun. We're going to all kind of fun things. I mean, that's such a weird phrase. So anyway, point being though is we're not done with this conversation. We've got another good 5 stories, and we'd love for you to be a part of that. So if you would like to hear the rest of what Ken and I are doing, you can join us as a supporter. Listener support's what makes us possible. So if you'd like to be able to listen to the rest of this, all you have to do is head to patreon.com/politicsguys or politicsguys.com/support. On Venmo, we're at politicsguys. So again, that's patreon.com/politicsguys or politicsguys.com/support. And again, on Venmo, we're at politicsguys. Now, I also know, and I know this from personal experience, if you are not in a financial position to be able to support the show, don't forget, you can reach out to Mike at politicsguys.com, and he can also hook you up with the show. We don't want you to leave you in a lurch because you don't have that kind of financial means. But if you do, we would highly recommend that you do that. Get the rest of the show. We have a lot of fun things lined up to chat about. Because again, it's me and Ken. It's the 2 best hosts on the show. So join us. Join us for the rest of the show.